侵略者どもの好きにはさせねえ。Let's party!
So I recently finished that there Yakuza 0. It was very absorbing to see Kiryu's journey from a young man who faces all obstacles with a stern, wizened demeanour to an older man who faces all obstacles with a stern, wizened demeanour, while also sporting a little soul patch. And as much as I enjoyed permanently crippling a sizable portion of the population of Tokyo and gave up far too much of my life to Mahjong, it was something that didn't sit well in the back of my mind. But before we get to that festering tumour resting itself on my brain, let's have a quick discussion on what a Zero game actually is. So as the name implies, it is an installment that starts a franchise from its 0 point, starting a plotline from the very beginning. Well, as far back as still engaging. We don't really want to see our protagonist running around as a 5-year-old. Now if this was explained to you, you might likely say, oh, so it's the first in the series. But that is the cunning deception of the Zero game. A Zero installment is usually a pretty late installment within a franchise. Yakuza had 5 canonical games before releasing Yakuza 0, and Resident Evil had 3 numbered installments, Code Veronica, and a remake of its first game before its 0th game was released. Importantly as well, these aren't reboots. While both a reboot and a Zero installment have had the success of garnering new interest within a franchise, reboots tend to create a different tone or maybe even take a series in another direction, while Zero builds on existing canon. So let's get on a journey to discuss the good and bads of this phenomenon, and maybe eventually deal with my niggling problem mentioned earlier. Another quick note of clarification: for the purposes of this discussion, not everything discussed will be specifically called whatever Zero. For example, Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, or Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, if you want to get the proper name about this, generally fulfills the same criteria as a Zero game. Likewise, in your film sphere, we have those Star Wars stories, Solo and Rogue One. So we're basically looking at media installments that go into more detail about character origins or events which are responsible for the landscape found in later chronologies, and also they generally aren't reliant on the player/viewer having involved themselves with the other installments to engage with this one. So this won't include things like Prometheus, as they don't really deal with characters immediately involved in the original installments or have a direct connection to the plotline. So now that I've come with this contrived set of circumstances to always be right in my arguments, let's get going. So I would say that there are probably 2-3 good-ish justifications if you want to push a Zero game. We'll say 2 because we'll put the two of them together because they are technical ones. Firstly is poor translation or localization, or just even a case of poor explanation. Situations in where the events of the original are based on events which took place in the past, and now that needs to be explained within this first game. Now you would think that if this method of storytelling is going to be used, they'd put in enough effort to actually explain what happened in the past and how it links to what's happening now, but that doesn't always happen. Like again, sometimes it's just due to poor translation where key dialogue isn't explained correctly, or sometimes more expository scenes are actually cut out from the final product, as we saw in Final Fantasy VII. However, on occasion it's just due to the fact that you're dealing with a bit of a convoluted plot which hasn't been explained well at all, as we saw in Final Fantasy VII. So in these situations, you might appreciate a prequel game to clear up these grey areas, though I don't think you should actually have to pay for the latter where the writer failed to just do the job of explaining the plot. But as I said, translation and localization aren't as common as they used to be, so this isn't really a valid reason anymore, and anyway, it probably falls more under the remit of a remaster, but then again, that's a bit of nonsense we will not be getting into now. The other better reason is when dealing with very lore-heavy universes. There is a fine line to be played in these situations, one often not treated properly by book-to-film translations. While a novel there's an acceptance that a reader is willing to give enough time and attention to engage in all the details and nuances of a world, as discussed previously, films and video games then generally need to have an imminent plot to keep the audience engaged. One of the big failings of the original Dune film in 1984 was its attempt to summarize pretty much all of the book's lore in one thing, which just really messed with the pacing, whereas the modern reimagining sufficiently covers enough lore to detail the world, but doesn't hamper the natural progression of the plot. So often a good way about going with these detail-heavy worlds is for the first installment to rather just focus on a small group of characters and a kind of more contained plot, with nods and allusions to a grander world. Once you have an interest and appreciation, you can then go back into more historical details, for lack of a better word. So that's probably the best reason to do it. I suppose in a similar thread you can include the fan service angle of rewarding long-time fans with more fun times with their favourite characters, but I don't really think that continued fan service is necessarily a good thing. More on that shortly. So that covers a good, or should I say acceptable reasons. But even if you have a good reason, it doesn't mean you're going to implement it correctly. Going back into a series' past can be a very dangerous game to play, especially from a narrative point of view. It's similar to that good old science fiction time paradox. If you change something in the past, it will affect the future, or in most cases, the opposite of if we change something, who cares? The first one was ages ago and the people won't even notice. It's a pretty common phenomenon that these let's go back installments invariably make some kind of adjustment to a piece of canon, even if it's only a minor one. Or alternatively, you have the situations where you have a nice lovely game going on in isolation, but then suddenly there's a need to connect the larger plot lines together and then you railroad threads in just to make it connect properly. I will admit though that these are probably pretty minor issues. The one that actually nags away at the recesses of my mind is the way that prequels can create a kind of ludo-narrative dissonance. As mentioned earlier, these prequels tend to come only long later in a franchise, and because of this they can easily fall victim to a kind of accelerationist paradox. Now, there's generally a massive issue with making a piece of work purely as a launchpad for creative sequels anyway, rather than an isolated experience which has the potential to be built on, but more on that at a later time. But generally we have a first installment which is more contained and serves as a solid basis for subsequent ones to follow and expand on, and this is where our problems start. With your sequels comes bigger budgets, and due to that, and invariably being further in the future, better technology, and along with that comes an obligation and an expectation. The obligation is an issue which often comes with the bigger budget. You have more money and resources to develop your project, and so feel that there is a need to justify this budget. As a result, your sequel is more flashy, visuals, action scenes, and all that palaver. And tied into this is expectation, from two sources usually. The first person with expectations or the executives who provide the budget, who demand that their overworked and underpaid employees make some bland big budget nonsense which makes 25% profit just so they can fire them afterwards because there wasn't enough growth in this business year. The other expectation comes from the prospective audience, who also expect this escalation to an extent, not just in terms of technical aspect, but when it comes to plot related matters as well. As the narrative thread continues to expand, there's generally an expectation that there will be an escalation in conflict, a raising of the stakes, and therein the problem lies with your blast back to the past after a succession of chronological progressions. You've had like 3 installments ratcheting up your intensity, so it'd be quite a lurch if the next one suddenly just centre on our protagonist tending to his garden or something. But then conversely we have the other problem of it not making much narrative sense, since you're supposed to see some kind of humble beginnings of our characters, but now it's the most hyper-explosive events you've experienced throughout the series, so it makes one wonder if there would be anything that could actually ever face these characters for the rest of their lives. Why is Rebecca Chambers so shocked to be in a house full of
terrible demons? Ouch!
She has just seen a bloody leech man. Is Kazuma-Kiryu really going to be put off by anything in his future after being involved in this massive internal clan war? You would think after what they've been through, nothing's going to ever have an effect on them in the future. We also have a situation in which these characters develop new skills in these Zero installments which aren't featured in the original game. So what, do they just suffer some kind of brain damage that they just forgot how to do these things? Well, it might explain why they're shocked by things that should be coming across as pretty arbitrary by now. And that's not to say that it's impossible to do this well. We'll make actually use of a good example, one where I'll make use of my arbitrary stretching of an earlier definition. Because we're only talking about Metal Gear Solid 3, which yes has a 3 and not a 0, but it generally ticks all the other boxes. Firstly, it is a late installment, which is really not that important. It goes back to the origin of the entire narrative of the series, and while the experience is definitely heightened, you don't need to have played the others in order to follow what's going on. Now, the Metal Gear series is not one where you see the first installment, well the first solid installment, being outmatched in terms of intensity, given that it involves the stopping of a nuclear launch, but there was definitely a noticeable explanation, given how Peace Walker involves the averting of a nuclear holocaust seconds within it actually happening. But what it does do to avoid falling victim to the same issues as others is the use of an alternative protagonist. Since the games that delve into the events before where the series actually starts center on Naked Snake / Big Boss rather than Solid Snake, we're able to avoid the aforementioned escalation issue. Added to the simplicity of it just being a different character, the plot is also written to make Solid Snake Big Boss's son, so this enables the narrative of the son living within the shadow of the father and being expected to outshine his achievements. And so because of this, if events in the prequel are extremely over the top, it just feeds more into the legend that Solid Snake must live up to. This has been so successful that there's actually a divide amongst series fandom with regards to who is actually the better protagonist. However, this series definitely isn't immune to this prequel paradox. In fact, due to its very own plot, it is subject to a pretty unique version of this issue, and that is because of the extent to which technology, specifically robotics and cybernetics, plays a role within the story. Now naturally, as time progresses, technology invariably does the same with it, and this is where the Metal Gear series falls into the very mire it initially managed to avoid. While the Shagahard in Metal Gear Solid 3 seems to be suitably primitive in comparison to the various Metal Gear weapons that feature throughout the series, this is not the case later on. The Salanthropus in Phantom Pain seems far more advanced than Rex on the original. In fact, even Peace Walker shows more complexity. Yes, Ray and Arsenal Gear from Metal Gear Solid 2 are definitely more advanced, but that doesn't cover for a situation where weapons made in 1974 and 84 respectively seem to be more dangerous than one from 2005. I mean, which of these would you rather be chased by?
Stay alert. You're not out of the woods yet.
You could argue that Metal Gear Solid 1 came out in 1998 compared to Phantom Pain in 2015, and so therefore we have a better understanding of cybernetics and robotics, and so can give a better explanation of the details of these weapons. But given that this is supposed to be an immersive experience, and you're not supposed to be considering the outside world, this isn't really much of a valid excuse. And exactly who is actually the greatest sniper of all time? In Metal Gear Solid 1, we have Sniper Wolf coming up, and we are told about how she has this amazing ability to lie in wait for days on end, and she's such a great sniper. But then in Metal Gear Solid 3, you're told about a man who literally absorbs sunlight. And then in 5, we have Quiet, who has the ability to hit a person in a jet while riding in a moving helicopter. So it's hard to buy Sniper Wolf as this amazing fearsome sniper when she seems to really pale in comparison to those who came before her. So it is definitely a very fine line that must be treaded if you're going to attempt to do this. And really it does come across as a pretty futile effort for one simple reason. Despite me earlier giving 2 possible good reasons for making a prequel game, it's pretty much never really necessary. We don't have to know every single aspect of our protagonist's life story, and the first installment should probably give enough detail to work off of anyway. That's not to say that there can't be a bit of delving into the past for like a reveal of some sort. It's just that you shouldn't be getting mired in backstory. It can be nice for a character that you spend hours with showing more development. You don't get that by just throwing out details about their past, especially if their personality isn't really that different to how it will be in the future. And add to that, there is not even always a necessity to know more about your protagonist. Take Kat from Gravity Rush. We start our adventures with her having no recollection of who she is and in the company of Dusty, the supernatural gravity cat. And to be honest, that is really all we need. Kat is cheery and optimistic, she shows a selfless willingness to help others, but also gets frustrated with the poor treatment she tends to receive and would appreciate some recognition and praise for all the work she does for others. We have a fairly rounded character who serves as a good individual to base a series of wacky and surreal escapades around. At no point did I ever see a need or have a desire to find anything else about Kat. The nods to her connection with the supernatural adding a little bit of fun mystery to on occasion. But then Gravity Rush 2 decided to add this long sprawl at the end, giving an extended explanation of who she really is and how she ties into the whole grander scheme of everything. This not only made the entire game feel exhaustingly overlong, it also took her from being an everyday person adapting to living with powers that she doesn't really understand to some kind of benevolent, overpowerful deity. Made even sadder by the fact that the second installment started with her being taken out of a situation in which she was a cherished member of her community, receiving the acclaim that she had sought throughout the first game, and desperately trying to obtain that acceptance again. In a similar vein, we have the Uncharted series, where we spent considerable game time learning about Drake's friendship with Sully, and how he spent time with his brother, and how he got his name. I really didn't need to know these things. I thought he was just a prat who wanted treasure. That's really all I needed to know. We can further move on by looking at 2 pieces from above average sci-fi series Star Wars. Firstly, starting with Solo, the wonderful adventures of Han Solo that no one really cared about. Now, I never actually saw the film, to be honest, but did you really need to? Does it even need to exist? Much like Kat, we know enough about Han Solo from his appearances in the mainline series that we really didn't need to have an entire film dedicated to his background. And from what I could see, it didn't really add anything to his personality. Shock horror, questions asked in Parliament. And then you have Rogue One, a movie that I actually liked. Well, I say I like it, I don't actually remember pretty much anything from it, so make of that what you will. Anyway, what I do remember while watching it is that the whole thing seemed to be created merely to explain the hole in the Death Star thing. And that's some really weak source reason to make a piece of art. Creators need to stop this toxic attitude of attempting to cover up possible mistakes or answer back to criticisms that their work received, provided they're valid, of course. Even if this hole was a serious plot hole, which is highly doubtful, it really isn't something to obsess over. Fans of an art will always pick apart every single aspect of that art, often in a more jokey form, so there's really no point in trying to go back to address each single one. Don't even get me started on the Eagles and the Lord of the Rings thing. So we have now gone through possible acceptable reasons for making a prequel, and how it could possibly be ruined despite being done for a better reason, as well as when it's unnecessary to do so. But none of these really matter since I've been discussing the prequel phenomenon in good faith, analysing it from a discussion of art perspective, but let's be honest, that is not the consideration made in these situations. These decisions are purely made with the goal of sucking as much money from the fans as much as possible. Rogue One wasn't made because there was a desperate artistic need to redress a plot point they were concerned about. It was an excuse to make another Star Wars movie and milk money for a fan base. Resident Evil 0 wasn't a story that desperately needed to be told. It was a choice to make another Resident Evil game to sell. Likewise, Yakuza 0 was another Yakuza game to play around with Kiryu and cause concussions. To put it simply, on balance, prequels fall within the exact same categories as remasters and remakes, that being unnecessary and designed to siphon cash from people who are happy to keep consuming it as long as it features familiar faces and environment. It is nothing more than milking of something that's already got a reliable enough market base, and if it creates more fans, well, great. This is further reinforced by the fact that despite my earlier claims, these kind of prequels aren't actually very inviting to newcomers. Again, we'll just look at Rogue One, a nice isolated story, but then at the end Darth Vader comes in to reenact his debut. I realize it's a pretty safe bet that people will know who Darth Vader is, but it's still a betrayal of the idea of a from-the-scratch prequel. Likewise with Yakuza 0, the plot doesn't even end close to the events that lead Kiryu going to prison, which is a feature of the first game. Instead, it just ends with a little text blurb saying 10 years later, Kiryu did a naughty thing. And then you also have the fact that throughout the entire plotline of Yakuza 0, Kiryu and Majima did not see each other once, but then we have a whole ending moment dedicated to the which is something that the series of the fans would very much appreciate, but otherwise you won't know about. That's not to say you can't have series references in your prequels, it's just be a little bit more subtle about them, so people who aren't aware of it don't feel completely left out. I'm also not saying making use of these worlds is completely out of bounds, just be more creative with it. Specifically when you've created these very large worlds, why are you limiting yourself to the small locale? Sure, there are other people in this world who are doing something interesting, but how many times does media based off of these franchises just refer to the same thing over and over again? Lord of the Rings games are pretty much always just the events of the movies. How many Star Wars games have to tie into Anakin or Luke Skywalker? Not just games, even the media as a whole. Ironically, the Yakuza series has actually done this with its most recent release moving to a new character, and it's been really well received. Similarly, Resident Evil, after being so bloated from all its convoluted nonsense, moved on to a different character, being more isolated, and it was very, very good. So it just goes to show that something new can be created if just a little bit of effort is put in. So as consumers, maybe it's time to shun these lazy, uncreative quick releases and actually demand something creative for a change. It's very easy for me to sit here and get all in high and mighty and lecture about being a wily consumer, but that won't be changing my behavior or anyone else's. And that's because this gobbling up of the succession of mass-produced stats is bypassing our rational thinking and playing off our emotional reasoning. There are, of course, as always, socioeconomic reasons for this, but I'm far too pretentious and middle class for that, so we'll be looking at the philosophical matters. Why do we get so excited by new installments in a franchise? Why do we get so enthused by yet another adventure with a character we've spent more time with than some family members? I would say that is the simplicity of this uncertainty without them. Take a look at the way that in times of hardship we look back into our past and mention how much better it was back then. And then, when it passes, we come across another difficult time, we think back and say, well, I suppose it wasn't that bad. And that's because we survived it. Despite the difficulties that we experienced, we knew we came out alright, and that we will probably be able to handle it in the future if we have to face it again. It is the uncertainty that is the issue. We fear the unknown because we don't know if we'll be able to deal with it. Existentialism, the philosophy of the meaning of our existence, delves strongly into this uncertainty. Sartre specifically wrote of the anguish of freedom, the idea that we are free to do whatever we like, but due to this we experience an existential pain. Because the world has no intrinsic meaning, there is no objective moral truth or way to behave, and so we are not sure how we should interact in the majority of our situations. And so we create society, norms and rules, in order to provide a set of regulations of how to live life and give us some stability from this uncertainty. And this applies to our media consumption as well, obviously to a less severe degree. We stick to franchises because we know what we're going to get. We have a general idea of what the mechanics are going to be, we know the world that we're going to be moving around in, and we have characters that we've come to know and have attached ourselves to who can lead us through the things we aren't comfortable with. We can see this with the kind of animosity that comes about when established franchises change up their features. Or look at the furore when Metal Gear Solid 2 made Raiden the main character. We were robbed of the things that gave us a feeling of comfort and certainty. Or maybe it's just because Raiden is really annoying.
Colonel, I've got Emma Emmerich here. We've managed to avoid drowning.
Ironically, it is kind of because of their being long running that they can get away with this change. We are more willing to accept the change if it is done by someone that we trust to be able to handle it. Death Stranding looked like and is some real bonkers nonsense, but enough people were willing to give it a try since it was a Kojima game and we know his track record of bonkers nonsense. And this little tag here is important. because despite the general attachment to the sameness, there is a desire to see some innovation and alterations once we start seeing too much repetition. And while there's nothing wrong with having a comfort zone, a place to run to where you need to just relax and distress, but we must never be afraid to embrace something different. While there's definitely something depressing about the idea of the anguish of freedom, we must not ignore the beauty of the one word there: freedom. We don't have to tie ourselves to what is accepted to be good and correct. We have the opportunities to try something else, and through embracing the unknown, we may just come to find true enjoyment.